So I guess earplugs on. Ladies and gentlemen, in presence in Baku, earplugs on, otherwise I don't know if you can hear me. Good afternoon, everyone. It's 3:30 in the afternoon here in Baku. Welcome from COP for the people that are following us online. Welcome to our speakers, to our guests today. I'm so delighted to be here in Baku for COP29 at the Benelux EIB Pavilion. I'm Nicoletta Centofanti, LSFI CEO. LSFI stands for Luxembourg Sustainable Finance Initiative, and I will tell you a bit more what we do. And I will be presenting and moderating today's session. We have a special format, so to say. So we will first, for the first half an hour or so, I hope to be fast and sharp, present the outcome report that the LSFI issued this July this year on ESG data, which was the conclusion, which concludes it's the outcome of the working group on the ESG data challenges and try to understand the ESG data landscapes, identifying the most pressing challenges of financial practitioners, as well as identifying best practices to overcome those. And then we will have two fantastic speakers, namely Krista Tukiainen. I apologize, I didn't ask you how to pronounce your surname. CCO and co-founder of Climate Align, which is a fintech providing customized climate analysis on investment. And Krista will tell us more, I'm sure. And Dr. Julia Zinning, who is the assistant professor in commercial law at the Faculty of Law, Economics and Finance, or FIEDEF, at the University of Luxembourg. Both presentation and moderation will be followed by a Q&A, so I do invite you to ask and keep your questions for those moments. I guess we can all agree on that. In the transition towards sustainable finance, we need to understand where we are and what's the progress we are achieving. And we cannot do that if we don't have appropriate, granular, and reliable data. However, there is no panel where the data challenges are discussed. And, it was a bit of a nightmare. And when I started my work at the LSFI, I was like, what are these challenges, No one could, in fact, explain those challenges, at least when we are high-level panels that discuss the issue. And that's why we decided to launch this working group. I look at my colleague at the back, if we can move forward, and we can go to the LSFI. So the LSFI, why we launched this working group and who we are. The LSFI is a public-private partnership funded by the Minister of Finance, the Minister of Climate, Biodiversity and Environment, Luxembourg for Finance, who is the developing agency of Luxembourg Financial Center, and a body called High Council for Sustainable Development that advises the government on sustainable development issue. We are the coordinating entity for sustainable finance matters, and we help the sector transition. And we do many things for that. But I'll be short today, and I will summarize our activities with these slides, which contains our key pillars of actions. So we are a central point of information and a resource hub. We support the sector with guidance, recommendations, and toolkits, and we collect data over time. So every year, we issue a study on the status of sustainable finance in Luxembourg and a few other reports. Within the pillar 2, we felt it was important to tackle certain gaps that we found in the Luxembourg financial ecosystem when it comes to sustainable finance. So you see here the 4 working groups that we launched since our inceptions. As you can see, the third one in order from left is on ESG data, because, as I said before, it's a key challenge we need to tackle and address. And now, just for your information, we will soon appoint the members that will take the lead on innovation and retail products. But let's focus on the ESG data working group and the outcome report. So what was the mandate for this working group? The members had to clarify and define what do we mean with ESG data challenges, what are these, and provide recommendations and guidelines. We had a dream team, 13 fantastic members applying and being selected by us across sectors. So you see banking, financial institutions, consulting firms, startups, fintechs in the space, and data providers. Two fantastic chairs that lead the work. And a snapshot quickly on the timeline, just to show you that these working groups take a while. So we started back in September 2023, and we issued the conclusion in June 2024 with a number of meetings and sub-meetings to tackle the issue. The scope of the working group was on raw data. The group discussed a lot. Of course, you can talk about ESG indicators, KPIs, ratings, scorings, but they decided to take a step back and really look at the source of those data, because ultimately this will influence the outcome. As you know, garbage in, garbage out. So it's fundamental to tackle the issue from the beginning. Briefly again on the approach. So the working group had to decide, because they had a white paper. We just tell them we need to understand the definition and we need to have recommendation. And they had to brainstorm on everything. And so they said, how do we tackle those challenges? Do we choose by use case, like on risks, on lending, or do we look at financial institutions? Do we look only at banks? Do we look only at investment funds? Or do we look by asset types? And that was the favorable decision. So they decided to choose asset types to tackle those challenges. Then, I'm telling you the methodology because it's important you understand the reasoning behind. They decided to divide themselves into subgroups because, of course, it's rare to find an expert on all those asset types when it comes to ESG data. You have to be really a knowledgeable and expert. And hence, they decided to appoint themselves for every single working group, every single subgroup within the group. And they had multiple meetings on top of the plenary sessions. And how did they proceed? Basically, they first identified 11 main categories, I will talk about them in a moment, that defines the so-called ESG data challenges. Then they appointed for all these challenges per asset class, specifically targeting those asset types that we mentioned before. Since there were many, they had to prioritize. Hence, they identified top 5 challenges per each asset type, as well as challenges that are applied across asset type. And finally, as per mandate, they provided recommendations. It is important also to mention that we validated those outcomes with the external data providers that were chosen by the working group members. Let's go through the main challenges categories identified. And here, when I saw that, I said, I knew it. I knew it that the ESG challenges were many more. So you have challenges on availability, accessibility. Sorry, I will go one by one. I may be boring, but most of them are self-explanatory, but just to make sure we are aligned. So when we talk about availability and accessibility, of course, is the data available? In some occasion, as you know very well, some data cannot be measured or captured at all. On the relevance, is the data relevant? Is it fit for purpose for a specified use case? Is it reliable and liable? So sometimes, if a data is not reliable, it may cause liability to the financial institutions that are using it. Then going to the next, the comparability and consistency. Of course, data that are reported across different standards, are they comparable? Are they consistent? We talked about forward-looking and demanding and transition data. So is the transition plan requiring forward-looking data? Do we have those? Is it a challenge? And then, of course, fast-moving and demanding regulation. This is very clear, especially if you live in the Europe ecosystem, I would say. And then technology and data management. The more we have data, the more we have to have heavy technology investments. I have a disclaimer to tell to the audience. I believe strongly that we have plenty of data out there. It's just a matter of identifying those challenges and be able to ensure that the data are of quality and reliable. And then, of course, there is a big challenge linked to cost. You know how much it is costly to acquire data from data providers, as well as confidentiality issue. So if a data point is confidential, can we use it or not? Is it subject to disclosure or not? Continuing with the work of the working group, as I said, stemming from this 11, basically they jump into step 3, so not listing all the challenges per asset class, but they identified key challenges across the asset class we've seen it before. So according to the group, these are the top priority challenges across listed equity, debt, indirect investment, and private assets. So you have reliability, comparability and consistency, transparency, cost, and regulation. And briefly also in the slide, you see what is the root cause. If we have complexity of measurements and estimation, of course, you will have a reliability problem. If you have opaqueness in the methodology, you will have transparency issue. Data and acquisition and data management is a cost, and that drives and leads to the challenge there. Just to give example, again, disclaimer, my intention is not to go through the report, my intention is to nudge you to read the report, of course, and we will share that with all of the interested people. Also online, of course, so don't hesitate to ask. When it comes to the top 5 challenges per asset type, the working group has identified the top 5 for each asset type that we've seen before. So private assets here you have in the slides highlighted in bold. You have the ones that are, if the speakers agreed, according to the working group members, more tangible, more, let's say, typical, specific for this specific asset class. So in this case of private assets, you have the top 5. But the number 1, availability and accessibility, and the number 5, fast-moving and demanding regulation, tend to be applicable very much to this asset type. And just to give an example, on the 5th, fast-moving and demanding regulation, the rapid evolution of ESG regulation in this space is particularly affecting the data complexity. When it comes to the next asset class, which is listed equity, you again have the top 5, reliability, comparability, transparency, technology, and data management. In this space, as you can imagine, when it comes to listed, there is plenty of data. I'm sure Krista can, well, you are more focused on debt, but yeah, also here, huge data, huge cost, because you have to build the infrastructure and the architecture to manage, understand, and monitor. When it comes to debt, here, again, you have the top 5. Again, you see some challenges that maybe seem to be repeated, but when it comes to availability and accessibility, of course, is a different challenge for debt than for listed equity, for example, right? Or for private assets, sorry, it was. In this case, for debt, the challenge is due to the predominance of smaller scale, non-listed private credit borrowers, who are, of course, less regulated, luckily for them. And when it comes to indirect investments, we have again the top 5. And here, as you, I hope, all agree, the ones that is very much specific to this asset type is aggregation. If you invest in fund of fund and you want to monitor ESG data, you will have a big headache in combining all the diverse asset management practice resulting of aggregating data. And then, as we promised and as we committed to, the members delivered on recommendations. And in particular, we had the recommendations on the asset type, asset class that we just saw. And then the working group decided that they want to do a step more, and they identified recommendation additional recommendations for all practitioners, and then they were not asked a recommendation, but they decided also to issue recommendations for LSFI, for the Luxembourg Sustainable Finance Initiative, and for policymakers, which of course we really welcomed. And when it comes to recommendations, I'll try, is there any interest in the audience on private assets, listed equity, debt, or indirect investments? Otherwise, I'll choose one, and then you can read the report. Let's go on listed equity. That probably is the one we are more familiar with. I don't know. Good? The recommendation, based on the challenges, would have been perform a comprehensive initial due diligence on your data providers. Use multiple data providers. Many investment fund uses only one single data provider for the other cost challenges that we have seen before. Ensure transparency on whether the data is raw and how it has been aggregated and manipulated. And then, of course, report transparent and reliable KPIs. Last one, developed a very precise and solid data architecture, and so on and so forth. And there were many very useful recommendations across asset type. I'll try to conclude quickly. They also worked on additional recommendation, as I said. In particular, they developed a questionnaire for data providers that financial institutions could use. They suggested and recommended additional data sources, and they had a look on future data sources. If we go to the questionnaire, I am very proud of the work that was done here. Practically, they developed a questionnaire of more than 40 questions, very, very detailed, and we can go maybe to the next slide. And in the next slide, you see the questionnaire. Basically, you can download the three-pager, from our website, and you see across the category that I shown before: data quality, data management, interaction, terms of usage, pricing structure, interoperability of the data, etc., etc., etc. They developed questions that financial institutions could use when dealing with data provider. I didn't know, for example, that the agreement exit, the contract agreement exit, is a pain point oftentimes because it's not really discussed. And when a company decides to exit from a data provider, they are stuck. Either they don't have the data anymore, or they have issues because they didn't tackle it properly when they had the first due diligence meetings. The working group also suggested other source of ESG data. In particular, they reminded the audience, financial institutions, that information can also collected directly from investee company or specialized database that sometimes are for free. And in the next slides, again, a very useful resource that you can find on LSFI website under Resource Hub. We have developed a resource hub with a number of resources, but tailored on labels, regulations, EU regulations, framework, network, standards, and in particular on data platforms. So basically, you go here and you see what are the free data platforms that are available to retrieve data, basically. And last, there was the working group also provided some inspiring points on what data will be available in the future. And beyond the first one that are very much linked to you, I think last one, and I'm curious to hear our speakers talking about that if they have any opinion on Earth observation solutions. Space will be, I'm very convinced personally, the future source of data for the financial sector. And to conclude, as I mentioned, they had the recommendations for us, LSFI, and for policymakers. In particular, in the context of COP, I've chosen two considerations. One on non-financial reporting standard. I think we can not agree with this point. I mean, there are too many reporting methodologies, too many standards, and we need those to become more comparable, consistent, and in order to foster transparency. And then another point that is not often, let's say, discussed: assurance. Do we want assurance on this non-financial reporting? Well, the working group believed that high level of assurance is important, but they also suggested that whoever will done this assurance is very much well trained, because it will require a unique set of skills that is not present in the market to date. And finally, to the LSFI, not asked, but we received also recommendations. And in particular, it was on continuing on the data platform. They particularly liked the resource and they used it a lot. They suggested us to work on master classes to help the sector better navigate this space, and also trying to develop collaboration with training providers, whereby more, again, training and upskilling would have been done in a space of non-financial disclosure reporting and in the understanding of the data challenges. I'll pause here for a moment in case there are any questions. Really, here, yes. Maria. Mike is coming, sorry.
Hi, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you. So my name is John. I'm from KPMG Africa. I am the head of sustainable finance. So my job basically is to use data like this to unlock funding. And I think that you've done a great job. The last bullet, which I'm very concerned about, is the utility of the data. The utility of the data. We build data requirements, but it cannot be used to make decisions in a way of scaling financing. Because whatever ESG data sets that you have, they are problems. And those problems, you use either funding, or you use debt, or use technology or knowledge to solve those problems. So I think that maybe there could be additional work to find out how the utility of the data can be leveraged to unlock funding. Because whatever ESG problems that or risk or impacts that exist must be treated in order for impact and also to scale up funding for these problems that we have. So I think that you've done a great job, and kudos to the working group. I think that maybe a conversation that they should look into how the data is being utilized, or the utility of the data, depending on, as you said, whether it's a private equity person or a DFI who is working on with intermediaries for a due diligence, or a listed company. The utility should be, the main cake, so that once we know how to use it, we know that, okay, these are the problems, ESG data gaps or issues that we have. Can we deploy a credit guarantee? Can we deploy a funding? Can we deploy a technology to be able to treat those problems? So, I didn't see that, but I think if it's there, it would be great for us to let me know. Thank you.
Thank you very much. What's your name again?
John.
John, I remember that, but I didn't want to make mistakes. Thank you very much, John, for the very pertinent question. I like to go. You want to respond, Krista? After in the panel, perfect. With utility, do you mean the impact and ultimate objective of the data? The use, but because I think here in the room, I think you can discuss with the colleagues from Luxembourg. We have a representative from the International Climate Finance Accelerator that can tell you a lot about the use on the impact space, and also the CEO of the labeling agency, how data are useful for a labeling agency. I think it's also interesting. But you're right, we didn't tackle that specifically in the working group. Probably an idea for a second working group following this. And we will take the question with Julia and Krista later on in a second with the panel discussion. Other question? Dirk.
Yeah, Thank you very much.
Not a difficult one, please, Dirk.
Dirk Zetscher, I hold the other chair in financial law at the University of Luxembourg. One question. If you recommend to rely on several data sources, you will face the problem that you may have data that are inconsistent. And then you come to a problem that you always face in finance. What do you do when you don't know which of several data points is correct? And I believe that it is important that we build some recommendations when we know that the data ground is uncertain. And so I support the idea to use several data sources, but my question is, wouldn't it be a sound idea to develop a kind of guideline, a kind of due process, stable databases?
I think that's a very interesting point. I'm not that expert in the space. I would love to have here some working group members to hear the opinion. But anyway, we have the two speakers that maybe can also debate on that point. I'll keep them for the, let's say, the discussion later on. Remember me as well, Krista and Julia, to bring that up. Thank you very much, Dirk, for this point. Is definitely one additional challenge is probably here. I look at the room online. I don't see any sign from our IT specialists. So we move forward, and it's time now to move to the panel discussion with our, as I said, please join me on stage, Krista Stukiainen, CCO and co-founder of Climate Aligned, fintech providing customized analysis on investment, and Dr. Julia Zinning, who is assistant professor in commercial law at the Faculty of Law and Economics in the University of Luxembourg. Okay, let me find the questions because technology can be challenging. So first of all, we wanted to start because we of course, I presented the report that was done by the working group members. Any considerations? First and foremost, please introduce yourself to the audience, and then if you have any comments or specific key points that you want to align in the report. Julia, you want to start?
Of course, Nicoletta. Thank you very much for this kind introduction. I think you said everything that was necessary. I'm assistant professor at the University of Luxembourg. I'm in the Department of Law of our Faculty of Law, Economics and Finance, and I'm pleased to contribute to this year's COP by having this nice discussion. So thank you for inviting me here. I think you presented the main findings of your report much more nicely than I did here with this colorful figure that I really liked. So first of all, it's of course the reliability of the data. And that is a huge challenge. Then the absence of global standards, which leads to difficulties in ensuring comparability. And I think that's one of the main concerns, that we are not yet at the level of quantitative data allowing us for comparability, but we're still much more in the area of qualitative data, which gives us information, but of course does not necessarily lead to this comparability that we need when we want to assess something and when we want to classify sustainable or not sustainable. Third, the lack of transparency, which is combined, of course, with the opaqueness of methodology, is what you highlighted in your report. I can only confirm this since, as I said, we are still in the area of qualitative data and having not yet moved to quantitative data. We have different data providers, so we do not have uniform methodologies. They are not yet legally required also. We are only moving there, and this is what we will observe also when we look to the regulatory framework. The regulation basically draws the image of a process that we are running right now. So we are not yet at the end result, but we are trying to accompany the process that is basically the adaptation to and the mitigation of climate change. So the target is moving, and that's important to understand also when we assess the status quo. And it's a good opportunity as a scientist always to learn, to observe and to learn, yeah? So fourthly, you mentioned that data is costly and needs analytical technology. I can sign up to that as well. I was a little bit surprised that cost was not one of the main challenges identified for the 4 asset classes. I expected that to be more relevant, to be honest, when I read the report. And the rapid regulatory changes, of course, are an issue that we have not only, but especially in Europe. So this is certainly something we're concerned with in the European Union and in Luxembourg also very concretely when implementing EU legislation. Is that an issue? It's a little bit the downside if we are the first ones to introduce a huge regulatory framework. I think we cannot get along without it. In general, the findings that the ESG working group presented in its report are consistent with the prevailing view that is also expressed in the literature, and I advise you to read a paper of colleagues of mine on the datafication of sustainable finance, which has just been published. If we can switch to the next slide. So my 3 main reflections are basically this differentiation per asset class that, as I have learned, was and a subjective choice, so to say, I think makes sense. Yeah, it's a very good way to classify. The questionnaire that you suggest, obliging investors to enhance the due diligence of data providers, is a very good tool in order to get something like comparability in it. The effectiveness, of course, depends on the details that data providers are ready to give, and whether the questionnaire becomes a market standard. And I think this is a very important point, and I want to highlight that later on as well. The fact that we can create standards right now can be much more powerful than regulation. So creating standards that are supported and wanted by stakeholders and market players can lead to higher compliance than top-down regulation and can therefore be much more powerful. So I welcomed this suggestion of the questionnaire. Lastly, the recommendations you made to policy makers were also highlighted in the report. I think you didn't mention them so much in the presentation. Prioritization of digital access to structured data. The development of global reporting standards, and that is again a crucial point. And the question here is, again, do we regulate top-down or are we going for standardization bottom-up? And this on a global level, and that is challenging. Why? Because the climate change is, of course, a global problem, but the effects are very different in different countries. And therefore, one tool for all is probably not always the right one. Solving this global issue with local solutions that match each other is the main challenge in my view. Moreover, which I think is one of the more important points, is the alignment of underlying measurement methodologies, and that is what we are currently about to do in EU regulation, that we try to have aligned methodologies that allow for comparability of data. And once we have that, we start learning, and that is also the point when we can move from input analysis to impact analysis. And that is, of course, the crucial step that we need if we really want to tackle climate change. So resources and training are always needed, of course, and transparency as well. What I would add on that list of recommendations is to permit the use of official estimates in order to balance the costs and benefits that we run when asking the question. So official estimates can yield a huge benefit compared to a comparably low cost, as if the data needs to be generated by all stakeholders on their own. I hand over to Krista. I took enough of the time.
That's great, Julia. Thank you. Nicoletta, did you want to add anything?
No, I mean, I think Julia was very comprehensive in her reflection. Thank you very much, Julia. Point taken on a few points that I think we didn't deep dive enough in the working group probably, but again, for inspiration for future working groups. Krista, please.
So thank you again for the invitation to LSFI colleagues. My name is Krista. I run a company called Climate Aligned out of London, and we're effectively a technology layer that surfaces existing climate sustainability, ESG-related information from documents, files, websites, anywhere in the system, as it were, which is mostly online, to understand what already exists. So I really resonate with the point that you made, Nicoletta, about that we have most of the data that we need already. We just don't have cost-efficient tools of understanding where it exists and to what use case it should map. So to John's point, I wanted to talk a little bit about the uses and the utility of the data from the point of view of who we work with, which is mostly institutional investors on the buy side, and then the banks and other financial institutions that are on the sell side of bringing sustainable securities to market. That now includes, to Nicoletta's point, also we started in fixed income, so mostly looking at bonds and other credit mechanisms, but we also now cover public equities. Just to give you an idea, there's kind of 3 levels, and some of this has been alluded to already, so feel free to stop me if it's too much. Why data? Why does an investor need data? You either want to first, usually, screen a universe and identify potential opportunities. Then you want to understand whether you should engage with that opportunity, so integrate ESG into your process of actually making a decision, buy, hold, or sell. And then you want to report back on the impact, typically voluntary, or for compliance and regulatory purposes. These 3 use cases can, in many instances, need different kinds of data. And this is the thing that we don't discuss enough. I think, and I've been involved heavily in the EU sustainable finance package over the years, including developing taxonomies across the world. I think we're going to run into some realities very soon, which is now starting, which you alluded to, which is to say, it would be great if you had harmonized reporting standards. That is never going to happen. Why? Because defining sustainability, green, climate, whatever, is a highly political process, and that's why we're here. Who gets to say in Europe what the transition in Africa, anywhere, looks like, right? We're not going to agree. So we're not going to have harmonized reporting requirements across the entire economy. That's kind of okay, because all we need, obviously we should strive for that, and I think we're making some strides with ESRS and ISSB and adoption, but there's every jurisdiction that has adopted ISSB into regulation has some caveats to it. Singapore has their version, et cetera, et cetera. What we can now start to do with technology, and I'll sort of reference a couple of different things where I think it's quite helpful, is understand where we can interoperate. So when we say something is green or sustainable, we need to meet a threshold, we need to disclose a metric or a KPI, and that's in a particular jurisdiction for a particular set of issuers of, again, public equities or listed equities or public fixed income or even private assets. What does that mean? If I buy that security as an investor, what does that mean for my portfolios elsewhere? Am I in conflict or even breaking the law in another jurisdiction? So we need to be able to understand where these actual underlying definitions, as you said, map. And we can do that a little bit faster with technology, and we can also surface the relevant data to map to those definitions in a drastically faster way. To give you an idea, we did, there's another event, if anyone's here still on Saturday, sorry to do a shameless plug, but I think this might be interesting given the conversation. And Tom Eveson from Morningstar Sustainalytics is also on that panel on Saturday. Impact Disclosure Task Force that was convened by some financial institutions a couple of years back has recommendations on how to fill the SDG gaps in financing, especially in local development context that can be applied across asset classes. We took reports from 268 emerging market corporates across all sectors, across all geographies, and mapped those to those requirements against 169 KPIs from the Sustainable Development Goals. It took us 3 days. That's 55,000 question-answer pairs in total in 3 days. Now, that's just a demonstration of capability. Lots of other people are working on it, I hope, also in incumbent data providers, because otherwise they're going to be in trouble with the existing operational models. But that's the way to get to moving beyond anecdotes and the debate around what is good to actually having a common baseline. And then we can plug those gaps, as you mentioned, with modeled data, which is, technology is pretty good for that too, and keep all the definitions and the methodologies transparent, because we can do it over and over again with testing. What does this look like if I use a different GHG accounting protocol? What does this look like with a different emissions factor or whatever, et cetera, and then start bringing in overlays of new data sources like geospatial, other physical asset risk data that might come from other types of remote sensing. What else did I write down? Ownership structure mapping, which is a huge pain point for the financial industry because you don't know where the boundaries of your responsibility or your investment lie, and so on and so forth. So maybe I'll stop there and sort of hand it back to Nicoletta to guide the discussion in whatever direction you'd like.
Thank you very much. I'm surprised and impressed on how many reflection can come up from a report that already is so rich. I do invite you, if you don't know Climate Align, to ask for a demo to Krista, and you will be astonished to see how AI can really help in retrieving data in such a fast way possible. She has a busy agenda, but she should find the time for demos. I would like, Krista, to go back to your point, since you mentioned that depending on the asset class, you have different challenges. You can't have standards or request the same type of data. According to your experience, and I don't know if you have an answer, but would you believe that certain asset classes have more challenges than others? And what happens across markets, since you work with very different jurisdictions?
Yeah. They definitely have different challenges, and thank you for that kind plug of Climate Aligned. Yes, absolutely. I'm happy.
Despite you made noise on another event, we don't.
Yeah, exactly. We're all friends here at COP. So if you think about it from the point of view of starting with kind of project type investing, which is often we have like our project finance instruments, we have bonds that, especially in the sustainability world, will comprise of some specified pool of use proceeds, assets, project activities that you have to identify before going to market. Those bonds and bonds in general are often traded over the counter, and they're in the sustainability space still predominantly buy and hold. So there isn't enough supply to meet all of the growing demand. For example, I had a very interesting conversation with the guy that leads ESG for all of the New York City pension funds at New York Climate Week, who said, well, we would buy green bonds, but our minimum mandate size is $100 billion US, and the average size of a green bond fund is not that, nowhere close to that. So we have a bit of a scale issue there. But basically, for them to then get their hands on a green bond or a similar instrument, they would hold on to it for dear life, which means the average tenor of a corporate bond is about 7 years. Governments, that's significantly higher. If you're a bondholder over 10 years, let's say, you're going to ask for really different things when you're trying to understand if your investee company or even a country, SSA, city, whatever, is doing the right stuff when it comes to climate or other sustainability topics. So what does their transition plan need to look like? What can I, as a bondholder, ask them to demonstrate, and so on and so forth? If I'm holding a public equity, a couple of shares here and there, or even a really big chunk of shares, but I might just hold them for a couple of months and then sell them off, I'm not going to go into that level of detail in terms of the engagement. And then there's obviously the sort of issues around how much or if any and what kind of mandated impact reporting I have to do to meet regulation. That's obviously the fund labeling rules in Europe, both SFDR, ESMA, and then now SDR in the UK, and so on and so forth. So there's going to be more and more of this like, well, what do I do with this stuff? Does it actually make sense for my mandates? And then what do I have to tell both the regulators and, most importantly, because asset managers make money from managing money, the asset owners? If you can tell a convincing story, that relies on data as well. And maybe as a last point, I struggle personally a little bit with the private markets doesn't have enough data thing, because, it's not in the public domain, but we have targeted interventions, and lots of, especially private equity funds that are massive, definitely have the wherewithal, the influence, and the resources, especially with some technology in the mix, to go, hey, I'm not going to buy your thing, or I'm going to sell off whatever it is, whether it's a company, ownership stake in a company or a project, if you don't fill these gaps. So I think overall, probably the biggest thing, and this is definitely true as a last point, geographical difference is definitely true in many of emerging markets that I interact with, both financial institutions and the buy side. We're just so overloaded with trying to figure out where to start and whose requirements matter the most in getting capital to flow rather than just meeting compliance requirements. So the technology piece for me and for us, and also is my hat as a senior advisor to the Climate Bonds Initiative, which is a standard setter in this space, is just to say, can we define the minimum sort of common baseline to get this capital moving and not spend infinite time trying to build the perfect standard and the perfect map and then never actually move anywhere on that map?
It's the first time I hear this minimum common baseline, but I think it's very much needed in the market indeed. I'd like then now to move to Julia with a completely, I would say, different angle, but try to tackling all the challenges. We didn't mention that much, but according to your experience and fantastic research work on challenges that arise when gathering ESG data in developing countries and in sectors where labor and environmental practices are definitely more complex to monitor. What would be your view?
Thank you, Nicoletta. I can only sign up to what Krista just said before I start answering your question, that the idea of having a minimum common baseline is worth much more than all of these detailed findings and the perfect standard, etc. It's better to start somewhere than not to start at all, and to give so much complexity to the markets and also to regulators in order to assess that eventually it will just not lead anywhere. Now, coming back to data gathering in developing countries, I would like to refer to a wonderful session that we had 2 days ago with the Alliance for Financial Inclusion here at the Pavilion, where representatives of the Banca Maghreb, of the Banco in Bangladesh, and of the Financial Regulatory Commission of Mongolia were sitting here on the stage and shared their insights. So that was really knowledge I was very happy to acquire and to be shared with here. And what we learned there, and also beyond this in our research work, is obviously that the data gathering capacity in those countries is more limited than it is in the European Union, for sure. Sustainability is, as an investment approach, much more nuanced in these in developed economies to start with. Whereas in developing economies, of course, the data gathering capacity, as I just said, so statistical public office, but also private capacity, is a little bit less developed. Although, of course, many of developing countries face the effects of the climate change and have to deal with the issues much more than we do, when we are still working on our paper tigers and on our super complex standards and more complex rules, right? Moreover, what is of course an issue, and that depends pretty much on the country, is, as is with all rules, and also this discussion between regulation versus industry-based or industry-generated standards, is that the enforcement environment is of course crucial to whatever we want to put in place. And in developing and emerging economies, that's often, not always, but often, much more an issue, and thereby limits the effects of mandatory disclosure. But, and this is what I learned on Monday, there are some countries that are really, really advanced, and from which I think we can learn something, like Morocco, for instance. Coming back to comparability of this global issue, there is, of course, the difficulty of comparability data from less developed economies with data from more developed economies. For instance, in less developed economies, the mitigation of climate change is much more an issue than the adaptation to climate change, whereas in our more developed economies, that's the other way around. We focus much more on the mitigation, whereas in those countries, adapting to what is already there and the issues that are pressing in the present is much more important. And also in many countries, the data therefore focus more on the natural catastrophes and scenarios that they are facing in their local environment than to more, let's say, abstract data that might be of interest to us. So the convergence of taxonomies and data approaches are at the moment at their very infancy. There's a lot to learn. There's a lot to learn for us from developing economies, but always keeping in mind that the issues that are dealt with might not be the same that we are concerned with.
Very interesting point of view. I think, I mean, to echo a bit also Krista's point of view, probably I hope and I believe that technology will be a key factor in facilitating those comparability. And I mean, you mentioned Morocco. I'm sure there are many other countries which we don't know that have fantastic best practice, and that's why I think an event like this for 2 weeks together, sharing best practices and really exchanging and trying to find synergies and areas of collaboration is fundamental, because every jurisdiction is busy developing expertise and there is so much room for collaborating further in the space. I would like now to get away from challenges and try to focus on opportunities, because we need to stay positive. There is a lot of many positive things going on. So Krista, again, you mentioned this minimum sort of standards, but we now face, let's say, an ecosystem when there is no standard. We lack of standardized metrics across industries and regions. According to you, how can financial institutions and companies somehow ensure consistency and comparability when they gather data and they report those data?
Thank you. I'm not sure if it's their job, really. I don't think they can. But, and the reason I say this is, I think we're going to, at least based on the trends that I see in terms of what we're pushing for reporting and disclosure in private sector entities, and some instances also from sovereign, sub-sovereign and agency issuers of financial securities in the market, is to continue disclosing this non-financial information as part of their usual cycle of making basically PDF documents available. That's unlikely to change, with the exception of the CSRD in Europe and having like a kind of platform for this information that will be operational from, I think it's 2027 or 2028 for big companies. So there's, bits and pieces of that structured sort of comparable data directly, supposedly, but that can still have gaps. The optimistic version that I would see is twofold. One is much more collaboration, and this is probably where the financial institutions and the companies' time is best spent as well, is engaging with the regulators to say, okay, so what is my minimum baseline, and how can you help me map this to the requirements of other jurisdictions where I either have business interest and exposure or investment interest and exposure already, if I'm a financial institution. And then secondly, to embrace technology. We don't have to have quantitative information. We don't have to have structured information either. The technology is now very much there to interpret unstructured and qualitative data. And that's how it's going to be, because these things are subjective and they are qualitative. There's some indicators, which we all know, avoided emissions. A ton of CO2e per million USD invested is like every investor's dream metric. That's available. We can model that. That's cool. For a lot of the other stuff, it's just going to be, disagreements and trying to work through the disagreements on, firstly, what themes matter, to Julia's point, which is really important. Yeah, adaptation and resilience does and should matter more where people are actually exposed to sort of life and death risk from these extreme events. And that's happened even in Spain now, just a couple weeks ago. And we should then try to push for the mitigation aspects where we can. So these debates are going to be what will keep all of these conferences busy. And then the rest we should, I think, and obviously I've drunk my own Kool-Aid because I run a tech company that's focused on this stuff, but we're seeing so much interesting work being done by academia, per our discussion earlier, by sort of trade bodies and conveners, incumbent providers, investors and banks themselves, to try to say, well, how do we just make sense of the existing data in the appropriate context? So can I run a taxonomy assessment of, let's say, a portfolio of 2,500 names against not only the EU taxonomy, but all of the regulated taxonomies that are either existing or in development, of which there's now almost 50 in the world. And there's more and more coming. And the same against the ISSB type requirements, whatever contextual implementation differences and nuances there might be. That can be done, and that drives down the cost, that drives up the transparency because no one owns the data anymore. That obviously comes with governance implications as well, but the data is no longer your unique selling point for anybody there. It's the ability to interpret the data in context. So I'm really optimistic about that. And to those who are interested in how this, more fundamental debate on who gets to set the agenda bar, obviously the conversations that are happening here this week and trying to set these new, I still don't know what the acronym is, quantified collective climate finance goals, something. Yeah, NCQ, GQ, yeah, thank you, that thing. I would also encourage you to look at things like the, what is it called? The common ground taxonomy between the EU and the Chinese Green Bond Project Catalog, which was already, China was, by the way, the first to come to market with the green taxonomy in 2015. So this is not new. Now we're at that point where in Europe, the International Platform for Sustainable Finance, which was spun out of the Commission's work on harmonization, is trying to do that across the world. And they're also going, oh, damn, we made taxonomy that's too complex and no one knows how to use it. So now we have to figure out how to use it. So that is happening both in the regulatory context, and then we have the tools to start developing, run a different analysis every hour, every minute if you want to. The compute cost is there. We can probably, actually that might be the thing that tips renewables to final cost parity, because we have to have it, because we need to power all these AI models and data centers and so on and so forth. So there's really lots to be optimistic about.
I'd like to continue on the point you mentioned on regulation. You were a bit optimistic at the beginning, less optimistic towards the end. But Julia, from a regulatory perspective, you are a great expert here. What opportunities do you see stemming from the current EU regulatory framework and other global regulation? And what would be your suggestion to companies to align on global ESG standards?
Well, first of all, I want to confirm that I'm optimistic as well. I think we agree that we're optimistic.
It's an optimistic panel.
It's an optimistic panel. Also because we're young and unexperienced, so... Well,
I keep it
we
for
will
you.
still be
I'm
more
less
experienced in 30 years from now. So depends on the
Thank
perspective.
you for the
we
young,
take.
Julia.
Well, I speak collectively for all of us. I think, first of all, the EU framework implements this double materiality standard, right? That means that we do stop screening only risks in our risk management processes for ourselves, for the companies concerned, but we also consider risks that we do to the environment and to the external world of our company. So this is this much discussed double materiality standard that is implemented in EU regulation, and that's a very decent basis for the future, and that's certainly the very right starting point, and I think we agree on that. The European Union is the first mover, or one of the first movers, with a large impact in the regulatory scene, at least, not in terms of ESG impact, but at least when it comes to regulation, and we inspire many other countries, which is good because we generate knowledge and we drive some regulatory experiments that we can afford because we're kind of wealthy compared in the world. So that's good that we do it. Yet, if you're the first mover, you're also the first loser at the same time because you do the first steps. What do I mean by that? As you already pointed out correctly, Krista, is that our framework is overly complex from the outset and subject to many changes, which is right if we consider that we're basically mirroring a process that is happening. So it's normal that there are changes, and changes are good, again, from a scientific perspective. Yet the technical standards of the EU taxonomy are too detailed and therefore hard to sell outside of Europe, to countries especially with less resources for these issues. Also, we have this huge issue at the moment, and I'm very optimistic that this will change in the future, but at the moment we look at the input side. So we judge sustainability from the input side. You'd already talked about SFDR, and notably the Article 8-9 SFDR classification between light green and dark green only looks at the input, but we are not yet at judging the output side, so the real impact that the measures that we take basically generate. So that's something where we should move to. At the moment, the tracking those data are associated to costs that are not yet justified by impact data for the moment. You said that technology is there to drive down this cost, so this gives a lot of hope. The question is whether investors are willing to pay for impact, and I think they are ready to pay for impact. What they are not ready to is to pay for law firms. And that's right, yeah, because the preconditions that we need to have the Brussels effect, which is basically being a role model for others, is that we can implement certain principles from the bottom up that have a broader acceptance and therefore broader compliance than rules that we impose top down, yeah. What we need to move to, and that's on our agenda in the European Union regulatory scene, is that we move from this best-in-class classification that we are currently aiming at to real impact investing, and also showcasing how this works to other countries, or at least inspire other countries and learn from other countries that do this much better than we do in the European Union. The essence here is also to analyze the impact of any product type, as is suggested also by the report. So I think there are various ways to go, but overall I'm very optimistic as well.
Thank you very much. I'll take a bit on the point on impact. As I mentioned, we issue a study every year, and the ultimate objective of the study would be to measure the impact of sustainable finance. But today, I mean, with our means, it's impossible. So we are not able to understand how sustainable investments are achieving an impact or not on the economy. And I think this is also a very important point you raised. So to try to summarize, we mentioned, we reflected on the report, we look at challenges, opportunities. I would like to see a bit the future outlook. I think we could have a working group, at least a detailed report on the different technologies that are transforming ESG data, blockchain, AI, OCR, Earth space observation, you name it. Which one do you see more, let's say, active in the space of ESG data, Krista? And are there any you will find most promising? Maybe the ones that we still don't know because the market is so fast evolving.
Thanks. Definitely AI, of course. I mean, it's come in as like a huge crashing wave since, who here hasn't heard of ChatGPT? Yeah, exactly.
Or doesn't use ChatGPT.
Or doesn't use it, or Claude, or, whichever of your robot friends, they're great. That's a demonstration of a use case, right? But it is fundamentally changing knowledge industries everywhere. And it not only in a positive way, but really for the types of use cases that we're talking about, absolutely. We can both build these models from scratch, train them for specific purposes, and then even tune the existing models and build engineering systems around them to make sure that we can always understand what the data is, what it represents, where it comes from, and so on and so forth. And obviously when we say data, again, it depends on what we're looking at. Often it's expressed in verbal and or numerical form in a file format somewhere, right? That's what most often we represent and try to interpret when we say this. There's lots more to say on that piece, but maybe I'll defer to, if anyone wants to talk about AI use cases in sustainable finance or investing, come talk to me after. I did want to pick up on the remote sensing piece, and also kind of to try to link it back to, I think the reason why the impact quantification piece has been so difficult is that we haven't been able to process the data that exists in mostly documentation and websites and so on, that is sort of a combination of qualitative and quantitative language and textual stuff, because it's just so much to wade through, and it's not cost effective even for the incumbent data providers to do that very often. You do it once every 3 months, 6 months, or every year. Now you can do that all the time. And then in addition to that, the other problem has been and continues to be, and this is where I think the most interesting advances now on sort of ancillary things to us are being done, where people are much more specialized, is the ability to understand how goods are moving and how stuff is being produced in the world and who you can attribute that to. There's very interesting examples also in the public sphere, and I'm sure the LSFI portal that listed some of the public data resources will have some of these, carbon tracker initiative, etc., that look at asset level data on energy generation and so on and so forth. We need to move past that now. I don't think it's going to be perfect, again, because no one really knows how to map supply chains and value chains for entire global companies, especially conglomerates, or you enter into things like what proportion of impact for something should be attributed to a special purpose vehicle. And these are all things that investors have to think about, and that we have to sort of in this industry think about. But that's all possible now in combination with a combination of the sort of understanding text and language anywhere, and then understanding through remote sensing in many different ways, much more detail about whose assets are where and what do they do and how do things move across borders and so on and so forth. And then mapping that back to things like, we talked about this before, LEIs or ISINs or whatever identification system you use as an investor or a financial institution to say, well, this is where the buck stops or where it starts. Much more to be done on that, but I think that will be sort of a roughly solved problem, because we need to remember that we're making these financing and investment decisions every day, whether we like it or not. And we're making them against also incomplete financial accounting information, which these systems have existed for, close to 40 years now, but still money keeps changing hands. So to Julia's point before, and I think we kind of both are on the same page about this, let's try to solve with technology and just better human collaboration, the problems that we can, and sort of move the needle where we can now, rather than trying to aim for the perfect. Let's not let it be the enemy of the good.
Yeah, perfection as always is the enemy of good. Julia, you mentioned already in the previous response a bit a few trends, I think, between the lines, if I'm not mistaken. But if these are desired trends, what trends do you observe, and do you see now for the next 10 years shaping the future of ESG data and reporting? And in your opinion, are financial institutions ready for that? Which is the most important aspects, probably.
And also the most difficult question, Nicoletta. So thank you for giving it first to me. I think well, first of all, I wanted to add on what Krista said. So qualitative data is, of course, not a bad thing, and we are now at the verge of going to more quantitative data, but the one will not replace the other, but we need to combine the two. And that's the right way. I was a little bit disappointed when you say we will never reach global standards. You destroyed my hopes. So I thought we could go in that direction, and I saw that also coming, that we will move towards more common, if not global to every detail for everyone, for everything, but at least some common ground in standards that we also direly need, I think, to assess. Not until the very end, because there are local specificities that remain on the local level, and we shouldn't try to bring them on a global level. That's perfectly fine. But I see that coming in any case, so this, I think, is one of the future trends. Then another one, as if we agreed on the role of technology, I think data validation is now a crucial element, so not only data acquisition and processing, but also the validation of data. That is crucial to combat greenwashing, because it needs to be assessed that the data we have are also right, and correct. And I think a product chain distributed ledger technology, registering all the different steps of a project, is a very good tool to do that, so that we have an aggregated result of this product value chain, which reproduces sustainability impacts. And this is basically the first product that we would probably need in terms of technology. And on a second level, we could then use AI in terms of auditing these data and to analyze and learn lessons from all of these different products, use it for comparability, use it for measuring, etc. So this is probably the direction where technology would move, or where its deployment would make most sense. The entire sustainability agenda is a huge datafication project and nothing else but this. But it's good because we see many areas that have been operating in silos so far, like sustainability, RegTech, and FinTech, now converging and leading to a better result for all of them. So that's my outlook. Regarding the readiness of financial institutions, of course, as a lawyer, I will not give a clear answer and say that it depends. So far, we see investment funds that use mostly exclusionary approaches. So instead of going for impact-oriented analysis, which is expensive and probably not so well paid, then also it's more of we exclude it up front, which is a pity, but also understandable for where we're at now, and which shouldn't worry us because it's a process, as I said. Better data, and you provide to that with your company, will lead to new approaches and will also improve what we have right now. FinTech and AI that are deployed now and that look more at the impact side than the input side, which is also normal that we don't do it now, but where we hopefully move towards, will open us an entirely new world with new powers and new strength, and much more relevance also to the changes that we want to conduct, and that is to be welcomed. So the best is yet to come.
Thank you both for this very interesting and positive outlook, I would say. We are reaching the conclusion for this great discussion. And so to really conclude, I would like you to highlight a few tips for our audience, assuming that among any of our audience here or online, or when they will look at the recording, financial institutions. If you were a financial institution, what tip would you give to them in less than 1 minute, please, so that we wrap up with, few sentences?
I would ask them to consider how they can embrace some of these technologies also that Julia has just pointed out in a more open-minded and quicker way. Figure out if you have a CTO or a fintech office and talk to them about your sustainability use cases, because most of the time we hear from banks and asset managers, oh, we'd build it internally or we would buy your thing or whatever, but it's too low on the list of priorities because this is still too small. I think it's going to be like 18 more months and then it will really take off where it's sort of mass adoption to the point of are we ready or not. And then I would ask them to figure out which market regulators or even industrial regulators, policymakers and trade bodies and so on they need to engage with and really prioritize like 2 or 3 key things and go all in on those. What are the key things that you need to see change or you can help change to make your own life easier when it comes to managing a transitioning portfolio against a messy and complex and dynamic world?
Thank you. Julia.
Yes, I totally agree with Krista, and I would add to engage in standard setting wherever this is possible. So contribute with your knowledge that you have. And whenever you come across indicators or benchmarks that showcase impact, note them already down because this is what we need as a next step.
Fantastic. So engage and assess internal capability and resources. I would like to conclude by thanking Krista and Julia massively for being with us today and for sharing insights that I'm sure we all appreciated. Thank you to our audience here and online. And I wish you a successful COP and a great time at home for the ones who are following online. Thank you.
Thank you.